Okay, thank you very much. One bit of advice I was given by my supervisor years ago was never stand in front of an audience when there's coffee on the table waiting. So I'll try to get through my comments fairly quickly so we have time for a more substantive conversation later. A couple of words of warning. At the outset, I'm not a geologist. I know nothing about volcanoes. I know they're big, scary, and kind of impressive and sexy, but I'm not going to say anything about them. My background is as a political scientist. And what I do is I talk to people. My background is talking to indigenous peoples about threats to their lives, and I was brought into the VUELCO project to be able to bring some of that expertise to bear in looking at how local communities are perceiving not just threats to their lives, but also perceiving the security experts, people like yourselves, and how they're trying to help communities. So we're going to run through a series of points here quite briefly. I'll talk about the research problem as I see it, some of the methodologies that I've used, which I think are effective, and then some of the findings. I'm going to concentrate today talking predominantly about people within urban communities, not so much within the rural communities from the target volcano. So what I'm interested in is this problematic about why do people make a decision often to actually move into an area that they understand is a high risk. So in the case of the previous discussion, why do people move onto the ground slopes of Vesuvius? If we assume that they're not idiots, and we have to, because they're not, if you make that assumption at the outset, you're going to miss an awful lot. So there's a research problem, and it's a very practical problem for us in doing any disaster management. Now, I'm approaching this from a different perspective. I'm bringing to bear literature from critical security studies, which problematizes the idea that people, communities, react simply to a single threat. Now, most of the literature that looks at risk perception makes the basic assumption that people are going to be concerned first and foremost with the one thing that we think that they should be concerned about. And if they make a different risk assessment than us, or they say that their concerns are different from us, we assume that there's a pathology that has to be corrected, that they somehow don't grasp the nature of the hazard or the perceived risk that we associate with that. So I'm coming at this from a different perspective, and in my field work, what I'm trying to do is to understand how they perceive insecurities to their lives more generally, to be able to place and contextualize the volcanic hazards within that. So what I'm doing is doing field work, talking to people, asking them within fairly long interviews about what they see as being the threats to their lives. What are their insecurities? Not insecurities, but I don't feel good giving a public presentation, but what are the threats to their daily lives? And also, how do they perceive the various wings of the state that are supposed to be addressing that? Because you have to understand that they're going to perceive you within that broader context. So I'm placing the natural hazards at the end of this within a continuum of other concerns to their lives. So how did we do this? First of all, I need to thank the Institute of Geofísico in Ecuador for providing a great deal of support, both manpower, logistics, and making this research possible. So what we did is to go within the zones identified as being high risk from lahars for Cotopaxi. Provided about half-hour, 40-minute in-depth interviews doing snowballing techniques. So basically going house to house to house, trying to interview as many people as we could within the limited time. So we had roughly 2.5 to 3 weeks of field work. And we have a lot of interviews. We have 159 that we did a year ago on the northern side of Cotopaxi, and 153 this year on the southern side. Now, just a couple of warnings. This is not a statistically significant sample, so I'm not making a claim about broader Ecuadorian society. I'm making a claim about the population that I interviewed and the communities within which they're embedded. But it is a significant set of interviews, and there was a huge similarity across them, which I'll talk about. In terms of the interpretation, a lot of this was qualitative, which means I'm more interested in how they're talking about the issues. So if they say scientists and give a big shake of, concern, that is as important as how they actually rank them in terms of trust. So it's not just what they're saying, it's how they're saying it. And unsurprisingly, perhaps in hindsight, in the northern area of Cotopaxi, people moved. Most of the people that we had interviewed had moved into the high-risk zone from Quito. Quito, which is a relatively insecure space, relatively insecure urban space. The people recognized that we interviewed that they had moved into an area that was at a high risk from a lahar. They recognized that it was built on lahar deposits. They knew that there were hazard maps that showed that there was a potential risk. And yet, every one of them indicated that they moved there because it was safer for them. Well, this is curious, because how do we understand that it is safer if we know it's a high-risk zone? It's because in their daily concerns, it is much safer. One interviewee said, "This is the one area of my life. If you can only give me 24 or 48 hours notice that there might be a disaster, well, I'm willing to live with that because nothing else in my life is going to give me 24 or 48 hours notice. Robbery, theft, kidnapping, car accidents, being unemployed, these are all things that are going to affect my life on a daily basis and I worry about. There's a big volcano, it's scary, I know if it goes off it'll destroy my life, but I expect I'll get a little bit of warning, unlike everything else." So this is absolutely crucial. I'll come back to this in a couple of minutes about what this means in terms of communication strategies as I see it. Now, in the rural areas, and I'll talk about the rural areas a little bit to be able to show the differences. In these spaces where issues of crime were quite low, a lot more people were willing to say that the volcano was a higher risk. Now, on the other side, also these communities have been in the area for much longer, so they have familial stories passed down about the threat 2, 3, 4, 5 generations in the past. So there is that historical memory as well of the volcano. But there was some of that on the northern side as well, but it was cast in a very different light because it was further down the risks that they faced. So they see the risk as being less severe than other areas. This is something that came up in just about every single interview, that they were willing to take on the risk associated with the natural hazard because it actually made their overall lives less risky. In terms of what their concerns were in case of an actual emergency, the first major concern that came up in the urban areas was a concern about their neighbors. What would their neighbors do? Now, this doesn't mean that they were worried that there was going to be a traffic jam to get out of the city. Some were. It was more of a concern about looting. It was more of a concern that if I leave my house, I'm not going to come back to anything. Doesn't matter if the lahar takes everything. I know my neighbors will if I'm not around. So there's a concern about what it will mean to their lives if they take that step to evacuate early. The next was a general concern that the disaster management teams were disconnected from their lives. Now, what did they mean when we pushed them on this? They meant that they didn't see them. They didn't see them in town meetings. They didn't see them knocking on the door. And worse, when they did, the relationship was very much one way. Yesterday we talked about arrows and the necessity of having communication. Well, the communication that was happening in this sense was very much unidirectional. They were receiving information. And in some instances, the information that they were receiving, they claimed, the community members, was patently incorrect. And I'll show you why in a minute. So if the advice that is being given runs counter to the local common sense, you have a big problem. You have a problem because the confidence, not just in that piece of advice, but the confidence in the system that is providing it, will be undermined. Okay, now I'm going to use this one slide to show the differences between rural and urban spaces in Ecuador around Cotopaxi. So in the rural areas, roughly 80% said they had had family in that area that had lived through an eruption from Cotopaxi. Now, they'll talk about this being 1 or 2 generations back. We know it's late 1800s, so it's probably closer to 3 or 4 generations, but these are stories that are passed down and are incredibly accurate in terms of where the safe zones are. And when I said that there was advice being given that runs counter to the common sense, what had been happening is that the disaster management teams had come in with a fairly rough map of the high-risk zone that didn't differentiate within the lahar field where the lahars didn't deposit on the last few major lahars. They were telling people that they had to evacuate roughly 10 kilometers. That's 10 kilometers when they're roughly 15 kilometers from the volcano itself. I don't fancy those odds. And nor did the locals, because they said, why would we possibly want to cross 4 or 5 rivers when you're saying there's a lahar threat, when our families survived by going up that little tiny hill that's 200 meters from here, where there are no rocks, there is no lahar deposit. And in terms of the individuals I talked with in the Institute of Geophysico, they confirmed that that was the case. That was probably a safe place to be. But the disaster management teams were working with a different scale of map and provided a very different evacuation route, which caused a great deal of concern that they didn't know what they were talking about. Now, this is not the scientists, this is the disaster response people. But that one mistake, which you can understand why it was made, served to undercut a lot of the goodwill that may have been in place. In terms of the climbing strong trees thing, I have no idea. Now, for a little bit of good and bad news mixed up, in terms of general overall levels of trust, not in relationship to a particular hazard, scientists fared quite poorly in relationship to 9 other official bodies within the Ecuadorian society. But when it came to the issue of the natural hazard, when it came specifically to the question of the volcano, scientists overwhelmingly did particularly well. But there's a caveat here, because at the same time, the state, and just about all of the wings of the state, did very poorly. So in Ecuador, we have the interesting situation where the Institute of Geophysico, the scientists, many of which are on TV, and people could actually physically name often some of the scientists, they're on TV that often, that the Institute of Geophysico is separated out effectively from the disaster management. So they're doing hazard analysis, passing that down, but it's the government that's making decisions about what they should do. That separation has allowed, in a way, I suggest, the scientists to escape being tarred with that government politics brush. Now, this raises interesting dilemmas. What happens if you're asked to be on a stage, on a podium with a mayor that nobody trusts? Does that raise the confidence in the advice coming from the mayor? Perhaps. Does it also, though, at the same time undermine the confidence that people have in the independence of the scientific advice? Perhaps. And I don't have any answers for this other than to say you have to engage with the politics of what you're doing, not just the raw science, in making these decisions. Because if you don't, if it becomes strictly a technical exercise, you risk missing all of these very important social dynamics, because that's what we're talking about yesterday and today. We're not talking about the volcanoes. We're talking about how we protect the people, which is a social issue. So in terms of the lack of trust in scientists, what did they say? These are just some of the direct quotes. It comes down basically to 2 things. They don't know what the scientists do more generally, but specifically, they don't know you. They don't know the scientists. They don't see them. If the disaster management people don't tend to go by very often, the scientists certainly do not. Now, for all the obvious reasons, we're all exceptionally busy. We have lots of demands on our time. Doing visits to communities that we're trying to help takes us away from the original science that we're trying to do to help them. But there has to be that investment of effort if you want to be able to nurture that level of trust in the edicts, in the recommendations that you're making. And by connection, also those connections that are being, those pieces of advice that are being given by the disaster management teams. In terms of the government, people didn't trust it in Ecuador much at all. I would ask that question, and often people would just laugh and go, seriously, no. And this is exceptionally problematic when they see the disaster management teams as being built up within or supporting the political infrastructure, in part by which I mean the elites, which are seen as running the society. Now, when it comes to the specifics of a particular disaster, some of these dynamics may change. And here's a caveat. What people say during a time of non-crisis does not necessarily mean that in a time of crisis they wouldn't do what the government suggests. They may. But the problem is what happens if there's a long, slow buildup? Or what happens if people's public perception, if their visual perceptions, so a lot of them would say, well, I'd look at the volcano. If I don't see anything, then I'll wait around a little bit longer, which I think sends shivers down a lot of people's spines. But if you get that disconnect and they don't trust the government, that's when it makes some of these possible reactions much more possible. So how do we integrate the observation, the observatories, into the overall management system? And I think here there cannot possibly be a single one-size-fits-all solution because the local politics are going to have to drive a lot of this. But it also means that we have to pay attention not just to what makes more technical sense in a particular situation, what is going to make it more efficient, but in doing that calculation of efficiency, it is essential that you take a look also at what it means for people's likelihood to respond to you in a positive way if you make those efficiencies more, if you link them more formally. Now, I've heard a lot of talk over the last couple of days, both formally and informally, about trying to educate people about the volcano. Well, here's the interesting thing. The north side of the volcano, generally, people were much more educated, often with university degrees. They had a lot more technical knowledge about the volcano. They were able to describe it more accurately and describe the threats a little bit more accurately. But they were also less likely to abide by suggestions, requirements to evacuate. The south side, where a lot of people were functionally illiterate, maybe grade 6, grade 7 high school, an inability to describe the volcano in with any technical sophistication, saying that the threat from magma was much more serious to them than the threat from either a pyroclastic flow or lahar, even though they were 25, 30 kilometers away, were much more likely to do what we want, or what we would suggest. Now that raises an interesting dilemma which has come out in some of the literature over the last few years, which is that more technical knowledge about volcanic processes does not necessarily lead to better forms of reaction. Better, by which I mean more likely to do what we suggest. So what I would say is that regardless of the level of knowledge, in terms of evacuation, the vast majority of people said they would do it. And in terms of an actual crisis, it's likely that it would be a far higher level of compliance than that. That's what we see more generally. And so there is no correlation. Now, what does that mean in terms of our education and communication strategies? Well, in part, what I suggest is that we have to be much more explicit about the ways in which our communication strategies are goal-oriented. Now, I'm not a communications major. I don't do mass communication studies. I'm a political scientist. I look at communities and I try to figure out what they think. So these are suggestions which we need to run past communication specialists. But it strikes me that we don't tend to be goal-oriented because we say more communication about the volcano will lead to better compliance, where the logical chain is that better knowledge is going to lead to more fear. More fear will mean that they're going to respond more accurately? Well, if the important thing is to get a particular form of reaction, so when we pull the fire alarm, people leave the building, talking to people about the volcano may be efficient and effective insofar as what it does is build trust between you, the scientists, or the disaster management teams, and the communities. Now, what that means in terms of the assessment of our communication strategies is that we have to move away from testing the effectiveness in terms of a quiz about their knowledge of the volcano, because that does not test the goal of the communication, which is more trust. And in a way, I'm ambivalent about whether or not they've got a better sense of the geology coming out of a meeting, if they have more confidence that you do know and that you have their interests at heart. And the final thing is to come back to that initial point about taking their insecurities to heart. If you go into a room pre-crisis and you say, look, the biggest threat to you and your community and your family is that volcano that you can see out your window, you are trying to convince them that all of their other concerns are for naught. You're trying to convince them that every time that they see in the news that someone has been murdered the next town over, that every time they're worried about kidnapping, that they are wrong. I'm not saying you shouldn't communicate about the volcano, far from it. What I'm saying is you have to take into consideration how you do that in a way that respects and embeds that within their lived experience, the politics of the everyday. Okay, thank you very much.